Mantra 12 of Isopanishad. I'll recite a line by line, and then you're welcome to join me. Andham tamak pravashanti. Try that with me. Andham tamak pravashanti. Ye sambhutim upasate. Ye sambhutim upasate. Tato bhuya ivate tamo.
Tato bhuya ivate tamo.
Ya sambhutyam rataha. Ya sambhutyam rataha. Andham tamak pravishanti.
Andham
Tamak
tamam
pravishanti.
pravishyanti.
Ye sambhutim upasate.
Ye
Ye
sambhutim
sambhutim upasate.
upasate.
Tato bhuya ivate tamo.
Tato bhuya ivate
Ivate
tamo.
tamo. Ya sambhutyam rataha. Ya
Ya
sambhutyam
sambhuteya
rataha.
rataha.
Anyone want to try? Ananda Vilas, you're always good for a recitation
Okay.
mantra.
Alright, let me try. Andham tamam pravishyanti.
Andham tamak pravishanti.
Ye sambhutim upasate.
Ye sambhutim upasate.
Tato bhuya ivate tamo.
Tato bhuya ivate tamo.
Yau sambhuteyam rataha.
Ya sambhutyam rataha. Nicely done. Anyone
Thank you.
else want to give it a go? Just unmute your mic if you'd like to try. All right, you brave souls. We'll go to the synonyms. Andham, ignorance. Tamaha, darkness. Pravishanti, enter into. Ye, those who. Asambhutim, demigods. Upasate, worship. Tata, than that. Bhuya, still more. Eva, like that. Te, those. Tamaha, darkness. Ye, who. U, also. Sambhutyam, in the absolute. And rataha, engaged. Translation of Mantra 12. Those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter into the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshippers of the impersonal absolute. Once more, those who are engaged in the worship of demigods enter into the darkest region of ignorance, and still more so do the worshippers of the impersonal absolute. So, where are we with this? Well, there are some terms here, such as the worship of demigods, which could be problematic. We don't run up against many demigod worshipers these days. And that's understandable. With time and with the passing of ages, cultures change. Esther and I were sitting around the other night thinking, okay, well, why don't we catch up on some movies? So we thought, what have we not seen? And we realized that neither of us had ever seen Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's from 1961. So we went to Netflix and we called up Breakfast at Tiffany's, which is this, considered always on the list of great American cinema. I was shocked. I mean, over the last 60 years, culture has changed so dramatically. I mean, I won't even go into all of the anomalies and the change of values and the roles of women and so many things that were kind of nauseating, quite frankly, about this acclaimed movie. And it's because over the course of time, things change. So that's just 60 years. Imagine the change of culture that's occurred over the course of the last 6,000 years, or however long it's been since the time that Isopanishad was codified. So while we may not consider worship of demigods a big issue in our life today, it was at that particular time. And it occurred to me, looking at this particular verse, that it's good to remind ourselves that when we're attempting to get inside the meaning of millennial teachings, teachings that do not reflect recent research, recent experimentation, recent analysis of the world around us, but which go back to a time very alien to the world we know today, that the role of the translator, the commentator, the acharya, presenting this information becomes all the more critical. And I was reading this particular verse, this particular mantra, and realizing, thank goodness for Prabhupada. Without his insight and his willingness to take us by the hand and lead us inside this knowledge, boy, what hope do we possibly have for understanding the application, the relevance of these teachings in the world today? In fact, the title Upanishad, the word Upanisha, means to sit at the feet of a master who will bring you closer to God. And of course, Sri Isopanishad means coming closer by the grace of a master to Isa, to the supreme being. So that's was driven home for me in realizing that we have some rather challenging issues in this particular mantra. And then I was talking with a friend of mine down in Florida this morning, who is keen on physics and the evolving definition of consciousness within the scientific community. And I was describing how this is such a challenging verse that we'd be talking about this evening. And he made a couple of interesting points. He said, first of all, that if the only thing that we, and by we, he didn't mean just him and me, he meant all of us here in this discussion group. If the only thing that we have to offer others is philosophy, abstract ideas, well, then we don't really have much new or relevant to put out there. But if we can create a bridge in thinking between these ideas from thousands of years ago and the world that we know today, that's a valuable contribution. And he said from his readings and interaction with online groups studying recent ideas in physics, he says there seem to be, and there's an agreement that there are 3 levels of approaching the pursuit of knowledge these days. One is what he called metaphysics neutral, meaning an objective evaluation of information around us, a rational approach to understanding the world through what our senses and intellect can understand. He said there's a second level for those of us who come from a yogic tradition, which is a straightforward presentation. Isha, the supreme being, the self as a non-material function, non-material phenomenon, a relationship of love and devotion that bind them together, the operation of the material world from the Vedic perspective, and so on. He said the third, and obviously the most important, is the experiential dimension of knowledge, which goes beyond discussion, goes beyond mere philosophy, mere analysis of the world around us. And that's where I think we are attempting to bring our discussions of Isopanishad, is to that point where it's not merely an analysis of the mantras and their meaning within their cultural context, but what does it have to say about us in our world today? So there is a school of thinking called post-materialism. And if you Google post-materialist manifesto, you'll find that this is a growing movement. It is a group of scientists and thinkers who are looking at the world and acknowledging that describing the world around us purely in terms of matter is incomplete and insufficient. We need to be able to acknowledge the limitations of our understanding of the world from a purely rationalist, physicalist approach. And he gave me a good example. He said, imagine matter, if we equate matter with a two-dimensional view of the world, and we try to fit all of reality into those two dimensions, and all of a sudden someone introduces a sphere. How does a sphere interact with a two-dimensional world? Well, it can't really. It will appear like a point that gets bigger and then gets smaller again and disappears. There won't really be an understanding of the value of a three-dimensional object living within a two-dimensional sphere. Now, we live in a three-dimensional world, actually 4 dimensions if you include time. And we're like that. We're trying to go from a dot to a line to a plane to a cube to a sphere and so on. But what lies beyond that? That's the challenge of Isopanishad. That's the challenge of the wisdom texts, is to imagine. We can't actually experience it in our current condition, but imagine, if you will, there are these other dimensions, these higher orders of reality that at this moment in time we're not able to perceive. Now, why am I going through all of that? Because a mantra that mentions demigods may seem like a cultural anomaly, like something that just comes out of some idol worshiping, nature worshiping tribal civilization. If we allow room for the possibility that devas, or the personification of natural forces, personification of the functions of the natural world, have a reality, but in another higher order of dimension than the one we know, then at least there's room for some conversation. And to put it in very practical terms, I don't know where you are, if this works for you, if you have this opportunity. When I go outside of my house and I look at what's happening in nature right now, I am amazed and always amazed each year at this time to see how the operation of springtime is always so reliable, dependable, predictable, and pleasing and gratifying. And the notion that there is personality behind that, I don't find objectionable. There was a lecture that I heard Prabhupada give when I was still a very young student, in which he said, behind everything is personality. Behind everything is personality. And when you've come to understand that, everything begins to make sense. And that really turned my head around. That just gave me another way of looking at the world around me that has continued to challenge and inspire me to this day, 52 years later. So let's open this up for some discussion. There's a lot of stuff, as always, in these mantras. And I hope that you will share with me your thoughts, reflections, where you are today. Anyone who has something they would like to ask or add, please just unmute your phone, your mic, I mean, and speak up.
Hi, Yogeshwara. I just wanted to say I really appreciate your teaching and how you always bring something that's so old and ancient and really make a point of making it relevant to us today. So every time you teach, I'm like, oh, he did it again. That's so cool. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. A little bit of appreciation goes a long way. Thanks, Julie. Appreciate that.
Yes, I also wanted to say that I agree with her, and I think that you explained this so well. I was really like upset about like like the Isha Upanishad saying that people who do not worship the form, are kind of like incorrect in their path, because the Bhagavad Gita says like you could worship me as a form or a formless being. And then the Isha Upanishad says that those who worship demigods or those who worship the formless God are like on an incorrect path, and so that's like, I think that's a little like sad, because as we embrace all nationalities, all paths, all religions, and the yin and the yang, like the night and the day exist, the form and the formless should exist.
Yeah.
So
wow. Okay. Very, very good. Bravo. That's see, that's what I like about our group. There's no right and wrong. There's no one way of looking at this. Here is Isopanishad. Here's the speaker of Isopanishad. Remember, always keep things in context. Context, context, context. Here's the speaker of Isopanishad coming up with what Jasmine very rightly points out appears to be a rather narrow-minded view. Why should someone who is a nature worshiper be excluded from the treasure of the fullness of the spiritual path? Why should someone who admires divinity in its all-pervasive Brahman form be excluded from the rewards of a full spiritual life? I think that's an absolutely valid comment and even objection to what Isopanishad is saying. So rather than finding this to be some irreconcilable tension between the Vaishnav personalist perspective and these other ways of understanding divinity, let's see if we can't find some ground here. What might that point of reconciliation be? Well, what do we know about the speaker? What have we discussed about the nature of this person speaking Isopanishad? We've said, from, if you will, taking some creative liberties, reading the later verses, that this is someone dissatisfied with his or her own performance in spiritual life. This is someone, and in a sense, it's appropriate self-evaluation, that you should never think yourself very advanced. As soon as you think, oh, now I'm making some progress in my spiritual life, that's when you're getting into trouble. It's at that moment when you think, oh, now I'm getting somewhere, that there's a risk of overstepping the limits of where you've really arrived at. So in a sense, this person is rightly questioning his or her spiritual advancement, right? So saying, I've never been a fully surrendered soul to you. I've tried. Please don't forget me. Please show me a path. Please remove this effulgence. Now, why would this person be so antithetical, or appear to be antithetical, to both demigod worship and the Kaivalya Advaita Vedanta perspective of becoming God? Well, it might be that at this time, remember context again, at this time, perhaps this person was surrounded by these ideas, that there's worship of this demigod and that demigod and that demigod, and a pressure, a social pressure, to become part of that community that was going in a different direction. That's a possibility. We don't know. I mean, there is no historic analysis of Isopanishad that tells us at this time, here's what was happening in this area, this what was going on around this person, and so on. But it's not unreasonable to think that someone who finds himself vulnerable to something will take an extreme position against it. Let me see if I can, here's a story. Let me tell you a quick story that might serve to exemplify this. In the early days of my teacher's movement, the Krishna consciousness movement, I don't know if any of you recall this, but there was a time back in the 70s when devotees would go around with bags of books, translations of Prabhupada's writings and publications, and they were being a little insistent on getting people to take a book and make a donation. I think those days, for the most part, are behind the movement now, but there was a time when, frankly, it was kind of obnoxious. You know, it'd be in airports or on the streets or in subways or whatever. And there was a reporter or a journalist from a newspaper, I don't remember which paper, who felt offended by her encounter with a devotee and sent a letter to Prabhupada. Sat down, wrote a letter, and sent him a letter saying, you know, I've met one of your students, and I have to raise an objection. I found this person aggressive. I found this person making me feel uncomfortable. And I don't think that this necessarily represents what you're trying to do. And Prabhupada wrote this person, this journalist, a reply. And in the reply, he said, I've received your letter. Thank you for taking the time to bring this to my attention. Kindly excuse my young student. In the early stages of spiritual life, there may be a tendency for beginners to become holier than thou, to take an extreme position. And the reason is that their own devotion is very vulnerable. It's very young, and it hasn't planted roots yet. It's not strong. And so in order for them to feel validated in their spiritual path, they may sometimes think they have to aggressively put other people in that same frame of mind and convince them of something. And he said, but this is the mentality of a neophyte, of a beginner. So kindly be patient and understand the situation as such. I think maybe there's a little of that going on here, Jasmine. I don't believe that the speaker of Isopanishad means to condemn anyone. Certainly not by what we see of this person's inner nature in the last few mantras. This is someone with a very soft heart, which leads me to think that this reaction to demigod worshipers and those who become one with God is a reflection of his own feelings of vulnerability, that until I become stronger, it's going to be very hard for me to be patient and accepting of other people's contradictory ways of seeing God. Remember, to be that kind of a person who can see everyone else, no matter how off the mark they may be, as a pure soul. That's the level of the Uttama Adhikari. Do you remember these three levels of spiritual practice? You have the Uttama, the highest level. You have the Madhyam, the middle level, which is where we should be aspiring to. And then you have Kanishta. The Kanishta sees only God in my temple is the real God. Everyone else's God is false. A Madhyam sees that everyone is performing their particular life's duty, and I will keep company with those who are on my level so that we can learn from each other. The Uttama Adhikari sees everyone as greater than himself. No matter how despicable someone else may be, the vision of the truly elevated soul is that this person at least is being true to his nature or her nature. I, on the other hand, I'm failing miserably at being a true lover of God. I mean, you can't imitate that kind of level of things. But I think there might be, Jasmine, some of that in what we're reading here in this verse. But thank you. Good comment. Very good comment.
I have a question in chat.
Question in chat. Oh, I better open up the chat screen then. Let's see. Well, I'm not sure how to do it. Can you read it to me, Anuradha?
Yep. It says, can you say how this position relates to animism by ascribing personality to nature?
Well, there's animism in a kind of materialistic sense of projecting onto nature an anthropomorphic quality of seeing nature like reflecting human qualities, which is perhaps very poetic. It's not grounded in deep knowledge of the nature of consciousness. The other way to understand that animistic dimension to nature is from the perspective of life as irreducible, immortal, immutable consciousness. So that in every tree, in every flower, in every plant, in every bird, in every butterfly, there is a living force there that is at a particular stage in its evolution towards full flowering of consciousness. And in the second division or canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Purana, we find a description of the species evolving, appearing in the world in a manner that conforms quite closely with Darwinian evolutionary descriptions. From an external perspective, there's no contradiction here. There's no friction between the appearance of species as described in the Darwinian perspective of evolving consciousness, survival of the fittest, and these forms of life appearing one after the other, and what we find in the Puranas. The difference is that evolution as described in the Puranas is not an evolution of bodies. It's an evolution of consciousness. It is the same individual Jiva Atma going from one body to another, evolving up the chain of species till finally we achieve a human form, which is the point where consciousness is sufficiently evolved that we can actually escape from that chain, that cycle of samsara, of repeated birth and death in different species. Otherwise, from an external perspective, the animism of Darwin and the animism of the Puranas appears to be exactly the same.
I wrote in the chat that I thank you and I understand your explanation so much. Thank you so much. So the Isha Upanishads were written by not Lord Krishna, right?
Well, it's a little bit of a tricky question. The Upanishads are considered part of the Shruti texts, the library of texts directly enunciated by the Supreme. However, many of those Shruti texts appear to be spoken by someone else. So, for example, Bhagavad Gita, which is an account by King Dhritarashtra's secretary, Sanjaya. Sanjaya is speaking to Dhritarashtra. Here's what I can see happening. Sanjaya had mystic visionary powers and was seeing what was happening on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. So this is not Bhagavan Sri Krishna speaking, it is Sanjaya speaking. And yet Bhagavad Gita is also considered a Shruti text. So here also, the speaker of Isopanishad is such an elevated soul that the text is part of the canon of the Upanishadic literature and therefore considered Shruti text. So in a sense, it's both. It's an individual being separate from Bhagavan Sri Krishna speaking this text, and yet the inspiration is so great, the content is so powerful that it is considered a direct inspiration. As Vyasadeva compiling the Vedas, the original Vedas, is considered a conduit for God speaking directly to humanity. And just as a closing thought here, I don't want to go too far over. I remember having having a conversation with Jonathan Sacks. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks was, until just a few years ago, the chief rabbi of the UK. Wonderful, sweet, brilliant man. And I asked him a similar question. I said, how is it that there are so many different levels of scripture, so many different languages of scripture? And his answer, I thought, was quite lovely. He said, well, Hebrew is the language through which God speaks to the Jews. The Quran and Arabic is the language with which God speaks to the Muslim community. He said Aramaic and the language of the Bible is the communication of God with the Christian world. I thought that was a rather lovely way of seeing it. So different languages for different communities, but with the same ultimate peak of the mountain there. Well, thank you all again for your company, for your wonderful questions. And I have this gallery view of you all here, and my goodness, what a good-looking group of people you are. Join me, if you would, in the Vaishnava Pranam. Vanchakalpa turubhyascha, kripa sindhubhya evacha, patitanam pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo namo namaha.